about. The project was started nearly 10 years ago now and has had phenomenal support, for example, from the Heritage Lottery Fund and from other charitable foundations. The site has got three parts to it, and you'll see a little bit of each of these tonight. One is personal records. We've so far collected some 2,500 records of individuals of this period. These are the unsung people. There's some famous people there as well, but they're the unsung people with amazing stories. You'll also get a chance to look at some history windows. These are small snapshots of events of the time, concise 1,500 words with images. And lastly, collections. We collect, digitalize, collect the most amazing pieces of equipment and artifacts which are around. You'll see some of these during the evening. You'll see something from our photographic library, and most importantly, perhaps you'll see 3 short videos, very rare videos, one of them nearly 120 years old, which tell the Jewish story. So the important point is that this is not just about military life, it's a social history of Jews of this period. It encompasses a whole range of experiences. So let me just begin by telling you a little about the context, because I think the context of the First World War period is extremely important. The First World War period and the First World War itself is regarded by historians as a transformative event. Things were different as a result of the war, as a consequence of the war. It was the end of the Edwardian period, which had only followed quite recently from the Victorian period. So society was turned upside down, both in women's rights, the suffrage movement, in terms of poverty, in terms of expectation of what soldiers should expect in their return, in terms of women engaged in war work, both in military work. We have stories of women as dispatch riders on the Western Front, but also, of course, in activities such as nursing. Some 1,500 nurses were involved, women nurses were involved, many Jewish nurses. There were 5 nursing corps. The period, in terms of its Jewish impact, is quite extraordinary. And I'd like to very quickly give you some context to that. It was an era that saw the death of 4 empires and the birth of one. Each one of those dramatically impacted on Jewish life, and indeed, in one example, continues to do so to this day. The first saw the breakup, the demise of the Austro-Habsburg Empire, which was an extraordinary, powerful, far-reaching empire which began to rot within, but nevertheless was a big force. We forget that nearly 100,000 Jews in the Austro-Habsburg Empire fought for their Kaiser, fought for their emperor. Some 55,000 Jews fought for our king. And indeed, when we were talking to the Heritage Lottery Fund, one of the things they found very difficult to get their heads around was the idea that Jew would be fighting Jew. And that's what happened. And we have correspondence of families writing to each other saying their son, their nephew, whatever, was in such and such a campaign. And there was true on the other side as well. The second thing saw the demise of the Ottoman Empire. This impact on Jews was very great indeed. This was the Jews in the Arab lands. We forget that in 1914, perhaps 190,000 Jews were living in Turkey alone. We forget great Jewish centers like Thessalonica, where there's some 60,000 Jews. We forget great Jewish centers like Aleppo, which gave us one of our great heritages, the Aleppo Codex. So the death of the Ottoman Empire had a profound effect. It, of course, led to the road to the Mandate. Eventually, the Mandate was granted in the San Remo Conference in 1920, and Britain held it for nearly 30 years. The period of the demise of the Ottoman Empire was something extremely important to the Western Allies. And two men in particular are associated with this period, a man called Sykes and a man called Picot. You may have heard of them. The Sykes-Picot expedition mapped out the future of the Middle East on the death of the Ottoman Empire. It was without regard to tribes, to loyalties, to what was true on the ground. It was only what the powerful people of the French, the British, and indeed the Russian empires wanted. A couple of years ago, I was watching the news, and it was the time of the ISIS was in its height. And there was this terrorist riding around the back of a Jeep, screaming, "Death to Sykes-Picot." And don't you just love a well-educated terrorist with a strong sense of historical perspective? Because he knew that what was going on today had a direct lineage to that period. It also saw the death of the Romanov Empire. The Romanov Empire had started falling apart, of course, before the World War, maybe in the mid-1890s, certainly on the death of Alexander III, Nicholas I, then Nicholas II. But most of British Jewry today is here as a result of the breakup of the Romanov Empire. It saw, of course, mass migrations all over the world of Jewish communities. Not only Jews, of course, Irish were migrating, the Italians were migrating, but it was a period of time where there was enormous convulsions, and the death of the Romanov Empire impacted Jewish life enormously. It's a time which was associated with the shtetl, which was part romantic and part quite true. You see in our site images, very rare photographic images of life in the shtetl. It was a miserable life. The last one to break up over a much slower period with impact on Jewish life was, of course, the British Empire. It staggered on to the late 1940s, but again, its demise began to impact greatly on Jewish life, not least, of course, that Britain could no longer sustain the mandate and surrendered it. But it gave us a tremendous amount of social upheaval, not only in the Jewish context, but also generally on its death. The British death of the empire was unusual in the sense that there was enough time for Britain to reinvent itself. And of course, the colonies and the dominions became this notion of empire, became this notion of commonwealth. And that, of course, still resonates today. Interesting to note that Israel was invited to join the Commonwealth on its formation and declined to do so. There was a birth of an empire, and that, of course, was the United States. The impact of the American empire on Jewish life doesn't really need elaborating. It was the powerhouse of world Jewry for the 20th century. It gave unprecedented access to all aspects of life, particularly social mobility was profound. Very few things were barred. There was really very little, there was some, but very little coordinated anti-Semitism. So Jews thrived in this time. So those five empires impacted in this time on Jewish life. They were examples of the transformational power of these events. So the beginning of the war, already things were moving, and by the end of the war, things were definitely moving big time. And we forget that Versailles, the Treaty of Versailles, just generally was the politicking. And in April 1920, the conference in San Remo, everything that was agreed by the politicians was converted into an international treaty, including Britain getting the mandate. But our site is not just a military site. It is about social life of the Jews of the time. It's about trying to capture different aspects of Jewish life. And I'd like to show you quite quickly two short videos, both of them very rare. And now one video slightly longer, but also very rare, and I hope you'll enjoy them. So the first one is everybody is aware of markets. Of course, we had them in Glasgow and other places. But in London, the market was, of course, Petticoat Lane, and I'm sure everybody's heard of it. This is video taken in 1903. So a very old video. It's coming on now, is it, Rodney? No video? Well, the video seemed to have hit a glitch. So the result was this enormous mark. Here we are. So this video comes to us from British Pathé, British Film Library, I should say. It is very rare, filmed in 1903, British Film Archives, and it shows life in London, the turn of the century. It is an extraordinary outside broadcast, if you like. When we show it to schools, they have two reactions. One is, where's the color? And the other is, where's the sound? But it shows, I think, life in a market nearly 120 years ago. Very rare footage. And this was how life was. Markets were big, powerful events. We don't see the like of them today. By the way, you obviously want in those days to have the concession for caps or hats. That's really where the money was. So that shows you the social life, because Petticoat Lane was inextricably linked to Jewish life. So the site is about these things, and you'll be able to look at the videos perhaps in a more organized way yourself. They're all there for you to look at. But the site collects these personal stories, these personal records. And the collection goes to what we call our Remembrance wall, our Yortzeit wall. And this is the Yortzeit wall. Every story on every person is connected, and you can see them now coming through, I hope. 2,500 plus people stories have been collected. And we hope you will be able to add your stories to them. And if you click on any one of them, you'll get the story of that one person. And if you look at it very quickly, you'll see two things, I hope. One is the civil dates and the Hebrew dates. The software automatically converts the civil dates to the Hebrew diary, Hebrew calendar. And this allows us to mark Yortzeits. And indeed, we can produce at any one time the stories, the dates of death, the stories of any one individual. Man was born in Liverpool, was a member of the JLGB, looks like, and we picked him at random. And this is typically what happened. He was killed. Oh, what happened there?
All right.
I'll pick another one. So Benjamin Falk. Very tragic story, again, died at the age of 23, killed at the age of 23. Born in... And then on this day,
Excuse me?
and right, so here today On the 11th of the month, if you look at the dates of the thing, you can search any date. So here on the 11th of 11th, 1918, on Armistice Day, Isaac Cohen was killed. How is that for rotten luck? David Gordon was killed. Alfred Helber was killed. Ellis Michael was killed. Sorry, he survived. He survived. And is Alfred Helper. But there you can see the how the site works. And you can see the family sizes, very typical of the time. And he was killed in action, buried in Belgium. Okay, so there we are. That's the site. So that's the site which is about personal remembrance and trying to remember both living people and events of the time and collections and so on. But this evening is actually about the collective remembrance. And for that, we hand you back to Ruby.
The Scottish Jewish Archive Centre, for those who don't know, is based in Glasgow's Garnet Hill Synagogue, the oldest in Scotland, opened 1879. We are currently in the middle of an exciting project to create a Scottish Jewish Heritage Centre in the building, along with our partners, Garnet Hill Synagogue Preservation Trust, and this will include a Scottish Holocaust-era study centre. The Archive Centre collects documents, photographs, medals, letters and memorabilia showing the Jewish experience during the Boer War, the First World War, Second World War. But tonight our focus is on the First World War. On the eve of the First World War, there may have been around 12 or 13,000 Jews in Scotland, and Scottish Jews played their part in the British forces in the First World War. An estimated 1,500 Scottish Jews served in the war. The British Jewry Book of Honour, which lists Jewish servicemen from around the UK, lists only about 65 Jewish deaths with Scottish addresses. However, the Archive Centre has compiled a list from memorial plaques, SCoJeC lists, etc., of 126 Scottish Jews who died in the First World War. There are First World War memorial plaques in Garnet Hill Synagogue in Glasgow and in the prayer hall in Glendale Hill Cemetery, also in Glasgow, which came from the former South Portland Street Synagogue. And there are also memorials in Pearse Hill Cemetery in Edinburgh and the Edinburgh Synagogue. At the consecration of the memorial in Pearse Hill, Rabbi Dr. Silas Deichus, then the leader of Edinburgh Jews, was clear about the significance of Jewish servicemen in the war. These soldiers of the race had fought for liberty and repaid the debt they owed to Great Britain, the great country in which they found freedom. Photographs such as these of groups of brothers who fought in the war, all from the same family, on the left-hand side, the Freedmans, and the right-hand side, the Bermans, these were to demonstrate a sense of loyalty, which we'll come to in a few minutes also. We're going to look at some examples of Scottish Jews in the First World War. Joe Greenberg, we have a small collection of letters from Joe Greenberg writing to his brother-in-law, Maurice Bloch, in Glasgow. Letters such as these are very rare, certainly in Scottish terms. We've got hardly any correspondence. So Joe, who's on active service with the British Expeditionary Force somewhere in France, on the 12th November 1917, he says, "We had rather a rough crossing and lots of the men were sick, but like the usual good sailor that I am, it never affected me at all." And he says, "We're expecting to be sent up the line at any moment. With God's help, I should be home again amongst you all." And thankfully, he did come home safe. He also writes, "Somewhere in France, we're having a rather strenuous time, and sometimes in the morning, I feel I would much sooner lie where I am rather than get up, as my bones are so sore and stiff." Benjamin Eppel. Benjamin Eppel was a young Jewish man from Edinburgh, Benny Eppel, who served in the Royal Scots 29th Division in Egypt and France. He's aged 20, and his letters have been collected in the book that you see on the screen called Somewhere in France. On the 8th of March 1916, he writes to thank his mother for the watch and postal order for 15 shillings which she had received. He says, the watch is in good condition, except the glass was broken. Life was tough for Benny. He writes, the heat today is worse than ever. The flies and the mosquitoes bite like anything. He's had a spell in hospital where he was visited by a Rav from Palestine. But Benny was seeing the world. He said, I was at a place called Luxor, about 18 hours journey by the train from here. It's on the Nile and it's full of nothing else but old temples. We visited the Temple of Thebes and saw some wonderful sights there. Julius and Joseph Diamond, two brothers, both enlisted. Joseph, an apprentice tailor, fought on the Gallipoli Peninsula of Turkey, the site of a long offensive fought by the Allies. On the 28th of June, 12 days after arriving, Lance Corporal Diamond was killed in action. There is no known grave. Julius joined the 3rd Battalion, the King's Own Scottish Borderers, transferring to the Royal Flying Corps in 1916. His role was to conduct photographic reconnaissance, and he flew many times over German lines, directing artillery fire from the air. In September 1917, after several mentions and dispatches, he received the Military Cross for conspicuous gallantry and devotion to duty. However, on the 8th of October, he and his pilot failed to return from a flight. His body was never found. Lazarus Wellins of Glasgow served in the Royal Air Force. I think Lazarus is, I can never remember if he's the one sitting down or standing up. Louis Kaplan, my grandfather, joined the 38th Labour Battalion, the Royal Fusiliers, a unit staffed by Jewish soldiers, also known as the 1st Judean or Jewish Legion. He served in Palestine and Egypt. Jewish soldiers in Britain were issued in both world wars with a special abridged Siddur, a prayer book. He wrote in his Arrived Jerusalem, 21st day of June 1918. He also noted he would spend Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, there. He wrote a kind of diary in this book. The Jewish community was anxious to show that despite their immigrant backgrounds and foreign accents, they were loyal British citizens. On the eve of the First World War, many Jews in Scotland were immigrants from the Russian Empire. The majority were not naturalized, and many of them had surnames which sounded at best foreign and at worst German or Austrian. Indeed, the British family at that time felt the need to change their name from Saxe-Coburg to Windsor. So foreign-born Jews were anxious to show they were loyal to their adopted country, and many served the forces. At least 2,000 documents were issued by the newly formed Glasgow Jewish Representative Council, the City of Glasgow Police, and the Imperial Russian Vice Consulate in Glasgow. They were issued to non-naturalized Jews, which is most of the Jews of Scotland, to state they were from a friendly country, meaning Russia, rather than enemy Germany or Austria-Hungary. The Archive Centre has a small collection of these certificates, as you can see. The Dundee Courier in 1914 carried the story German Jew derides British Navy about Simon Harris, a Jewish fish merchant in Leven, Fife, who was the subject of a riot on suspicion of having pro-German sympathies. Some to a customer or his family, and they thought he was speaking in German and assumed he was German and a spy. And his shop was destroyed, and he was effectively run out of town. Luckily, we know very few incidents like that. But the war had an impact on immigrant Jewish families. For example, Fanny Trott of 7 Muirhead Street in the Gorbals applied for poor relief from Govan Parish in November 1914, and this is her application form. She was left alone without any income to look after her 5 children, as her husband, born in Galicia, Austrian Poland, had been arrested the previous month as a prisoner of war because he was an Austrian citizen, and he was being interned, and it actually uses the term concentration camp in Wakefield in Yorkshire. She was awarded a weekly amount paid until April 1915 when her husband returned home. In September 1916, there was a service, entertainment and parade for Jewish servicemen held in the main synagogue in the Gorbals in South Portland Street. This photograph of around 130 Jewish servicemen with their chaplain, Reverend E.P. Phillips, in front of the synagogue was published in the Jewish World and captioned, "What must surely be the largest portrait group of Anglo-Jewish troops that ever appeared in a newspaper." Don't know if that's true, but it's a really good photo. And similarly, this photo shows over 50 soldiers posing in front of the Sukkah at Graham Street Synagogue in Edinburgh in 1917. Again, part of it is to show that Jewish soldiers are playing their part in the war effort. Just want to speak about another couple of aspects. Military exemptions. The National Archives of Scotland has files on appeals from the Lothians and Peebles Tribunal, where young Jewish men are asking for exemption from military conscription. For example, Manuel Berman claimed he was the sole support of his aged parents. If taken away, they will be left at the mercy of local charity, as I am their main breadwinner and only son. Samuel Goldstein said, "I suffer with rheumatism in the knee joints and back." Philip Levinson claimed his son Hyman was essential to the running of his healing business, as he himself was in ill health and could not read or write. Jacob Wedeklewski stated, "As an Orthodox Jew, I cannot break the observance of the Sabbath and the Jewish dietary laws relating to Trypha. These laws are broken in the army." All of these appeals were rejected. On the right-hand side of the screen, you can see an example from Moshe Glasser, who became a conscientious objector. So there were a few conscientious objectors in the Jewish community also. And I just want to tell you that some Jewish men in Glasgow, perhaps elsewhere, served as special constables in the First World War, including Abraham Naftalin, Samuel Green, Philip Syne, Maya Shore, and Bernard Glasser. And you can see the medal on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side, you can see Bernard Glasser's special constable card. So that was just giving you a flavour of the Jewish input in Scotland in the First World War. And now I want to pass you over to my colleague, Diana Wilson, who is going to tell us a little bit about her family in the First World War. Hopefully this will work.
We just need to unmute Diana and then it will work.
Okay, I think I'm unmuted now.
You're perfect.
Right, okay. Another casualty of the First World War was Hatzkell Tchureczynsky. He came to Glasgow with his wife Rachel sometime after their marriage in Odessa, Ukraine in 1913. They came along with Rachel's family, her parents and her siblings. Their first child, Chaim, was born in Glasgow in March 1914. And their daughter Sophie was born on the 30th of November 1915. Hatzkell signed both certificates. He was a shoemaker operative. Sadly, Sophie died of convulsions on the 19th of October 1916. Reisel signed the death certificate with a cross. At that time, Hatzkell was recorded on the death certificate as being a private in the 4th Battalion of the Scottish Rifles, the Cameronians. Did he know about his daughter's death? We will never know. Hatzkell was killed in Flanders, France on the 16th of April, 1917. He was known then as Meyer and his name transliterated to Tchureczynsky. He was 29 years old and his son Chaim was 3 years old. Hatzkell was my grandfather. Chaim, my father, his orphaned son. Hatzkell has no known grave. His daughter Sophie is buried in Sandymount in the children's section, and I felt partial closure when I attended the consecration of the memorial to all the children buried in that section several years ago. Quite a few years ago, I found a picture of Razel with a young child, my father. And on the back of the picture was Russian writing. I had it translated, and it said, "With good and eternal memory to my dear husband, Hatzkell Tchureczynsky, from Rose Tchureczynsky. I hope I will see you soon. We will be happy and kissing. I kiss you." I didn't know my little old grandmother, who I knew, who had long hair that she kept in a bun. I didn't know that she was a romantic. I believe that Razel received the message about Hatzkell's death before she could send him this moving message and photo of his son. All I have of him are the 2 photos of him in uniform and his war medals. World War I robbed me of my grandfather, frozen in time, aged 29. And if you will bear with me, I'd like to read part of the poem by Lawrence Binion, For the Fallen, which in a way is a tribute to all of those who fell. With proud thanksgiving, a mother for her children, England mourns for her dead across the sea. Flesh of her flesh they were, spirit of her spirit, fallen in the cause of the free. Solemn the drums thrill, death august and royal sings sorrow up into immortal spheres. There is music in the midst of desolation and a glory that shines upon our tears. They went with songs to the battle. They were young, straight of limb and true of eye, steady and aglow. They were staunch to the end against odds uncounted. They fell with their faces to the foe. They shall not grow old, as we that are left grow old. Age shall not weary them, nor the years condemn. At the going down of the sun and in the morning, we will remember them.
I want to thank Diana and Harvey for speaking, Diana for sharing her story and her experience. Okay, so we'll maybe take a few minutes to ask any questions, and then from there, just share some quick stories. So if you have a question you'd like to ask it, please just raise your hand or put it in the chat. I'm happy to ask for you if you don't want to be on screen. In the meantime, if anyone's thinking of a question, we did have someone want to submit their own story, and that would be David, who I see on the screen. If you'd like to unmute yourself and just speak for a few minutes.
Okay. Well, as Alan has explained, there were Jews in all the empires at war in the First World War. And tonight, I want to remember to you my own grandfather, Adolf Taubes. And I'm just going to, this is kind of not exactly screen sharing, but there he is. I'm fortunate enough to have him with me, and here he is in 1921. And I'm also fortunate, I realize, in that I knew my grandfather. So Adolf Taubes was born in the shtetl of Bobrka in the Austro-Hungarian province of Galicia in 1896. And in 1970, he was living in South Africa, where he had emigrated from Vienna in 1926. I was a 16-year-old in London, and I wrote to ask him about his life, including his experience during the First World War, and asked him which side he supported. Here are some extracts from his responses. To start with, we thought that the war would not be of long duration. I had made arrangements to spend the summer holidays with my sister Carola on their farm. But after a couple of weeks of my stay there, the news from the war front became very disturbing. The Russians succeeded in breaking through the Austrian lines of defense, and the eastern part of Galicia became a battlefield. with the Russian army and particularly the dreaded Russian Cossacks coming nearer and nearer. We lost contact with our people in Lemberg, it's now the Ukrainian city of Lviv, and when we heard that trains were no longer running, we decided that it was time to get away as quickly as possible. My brother-in-law was reluctant to leave the farm, so he suggested that my sister, her child, and I should leave first. And so he gave us the most comfortable carriage and 2 of the best horses, and having packed a few of the most essential things, we made off and started on our journey westwards. I had the responsibility of looking not only after my sister and the child, but also after the horses, which, in the circumstances, became our most treasured possessions. Wherever we stopped after a day's traveling, I had to see to it that my 2 passengers are fixed up for the night. All the inns were packed with people fleeing from the war zone. People were glad to sleep on a bit of straw on the floor. I had to sleep in the open close to the horses because I was afraid lest they be stolen. We drove on and on until we reached a place from where we managed to catch a train. We sold the horses and the carriage and made our way in slow stages to Vienna. Next, in response to my question, Grandad, did you support Austria in the war? The answer is definitely yes. Having had some knowledge of the tragic history of the Jews in Tsarist Russia and of the countless pogroms which swept through the length and breadth of that country, I certainly did not want Russia to win the war. In Austria, under the Habsburgs, the Jews lived in peace and comparative freedom, although anti-Semitism was simmering under the surface. Nevertheless, there were high-ranking officers in the Austrian army, many Jews were decorated for bravery, and Jews occupied responsible and high positions in commerce, in banking, and in industry. A number of Jews were appointed to the position of Geheimrat, Privy Councillor. Your granny's grandfather was a doctor in the Austrian army with the rank of Regimentsarzt, and a brother of his, who was also an army doctor, reached the rank of Generalstabsarzt, although he had to convert to enhance his chances of promotion. My last question to my grandfather was who he thought was to blame for the First World War, and this is his response. Taking a retrospective view, it's most difficult to know who carried the greater responsibility for this senseless war in which about 7 million innocent people lost their lives and many millions were wounded. Personally, I think that all the participants in the war were equally guilty. All had their scores to settle and their ambitions to satisfy. True enough, it was the murder of Crown Prince Franz Ferdinand which sparked off the trouble, and by Austria declaring war on Serbia, she would appear to have been the guilty party. But I think that Austria would not have declared war had she not been encouraged and prompted by Germany to do so. For Germany, it was a splendid opportunity to put into practical effect the test of her war machine and her plans for world domination. France and Germany had old scores to settle. England and Germany were viewing each other with suspicious eyes. Japan, which joined in at a later stage, could not forget the Russo-Japanese War. And so one could go on finding skeletons in every cupboard. So my grandfather did not ascribe the guilt to any one of the combatants in particular, but what he did say with feeling was that all wars are senseless. They don't help to solve world problems, but create new ones. Can I just mention a sort of postscript very briefly, which was that in the Second World War, my grandfather was in the Home Guard, the Musenberg Home Guard, patrolling the cliffs in Musenberg, which is was a Jewish suburb of, very Jewish suburb of Cape Town. So in the Second World War, he was on the other side.
I was just going to say a couple of things. One is that we also have information about Max Mendelssohn in the Scottish Jewish Archives Centre from various sources. Turns out there were 2 Max Mendelssohns, both of whom were in the First World War, but you must get this, Alan, all the time, were people with similar names. Also, I was going to say, with reference to what David was saying, that a number of Jewish refugees came to Scotland in the 1930s and in the 1940s with stories about their family in the First World War in Germany or Austria. For instance, Dorrit Oppenheim, who comes to Scotland in the Kindertransport in 1939, age 7. And her father and her grandfather were both in the First World War. Her father was in the Dragoons and he won the Iron Cross. And her grandfather was a doctor in the Red Cross in the First World War, also won the Iron Cross. And we have both of the Iron Crosses now at the Scottish Jewish Archives Centre. So it does give a bit of balance, but you can see why in some quarters Jews were viewed with suspicion at the time, because people thought that they might be disloyal. You know, obviously we don't agree, but you can see why people felt anxious. And lastly, I was just going to say, there's a question in the chat about the memorial in Edinburgh. There's a World War I memorial in the Jewish section of Pierce Hill Cemetery. And if you contact the Archive Centre, we can give you more details. So that's all I wanted to say.
Yes, we have the story on the site of provided by his granddaughter, of someone who was in the German Navy, and he was shot at, and the bullet was lodged in his binocular case. And she has the binocular case with the bullet lodged in it. He was awarded the Iron Cross. That did not stop him being sent to Theresienstadt not long after. And he survived in Theresienstadt because one of the guards was in the same naval group as he was and recognized him. And he survived and died in Epsom in England in 1957. So there are many extraordinary stories of Jews serving on both sides, but also surviving on both sides. Hi, everybody.
Bye.
Good night.